Welcome to the session on contemporary socio-political philosophy. In this session, we shall discuss the concepts of state, nationalism, freedom and society by Sri Rabindranath Tagore. The reaction and response of India to the Western impact is compendiously described as the Renaissance of India. Here, the process of Renaissance had not meant the abandonment of one tradition and the return to another tradition, but the recovery in renewed strength and vigor of a continuing tradition. The impulse to this renewal was provided by the Western impact. Renaissance in India signifies not the revival and restoration of the past, but a new awakening and expression in the new context of the genius of her tradition and culture. It was not the rejection of her values that was called for, but creative restatement which assimilated all that was acceptable in the civilization of the West. What is most noteworthy about the Renaissance in India is that even in its most radical expressions, it was essentially continuing with the past. It did not mark a break in the story of our culture, but provided a means whereby the past could be organically related with the past in a creative effort to build the future. Hence, we can say that in contemporary Indian socio-political thought did not lose touch with the past, but it was a synthesis of ancient Indian values and modern Western science. Contemporary Indian thinkers analyzed ancient Indian socio-political thought, accepted its philosophical basis, endorsed its world view and the concept of human nature, condemned social evils like casteism, communalism, regionalism, colonialism and economic exploitation, and suggested remedies. They examined the problems of our country from a nationalistic and patriotic point of view. They cherished the ideal of spiritual nationalism, and thus almost all of them propounded the message of internationalism and humanism. All of them were conscious of the crisis being faced not only by India, but by humanity itself, and hence suggested a cure not only for the ills of Indian society and politics, but also for the establishment of a universal brotherhood. What is most noteworthy about this Renaissance is that even in its most radical expression, it did not break off with the past. We can see in modern social and political thought the tension between modernity and tradition and between continuity and change. None of the modern Indian thinkers had in their search for modernity cut themselves off from the mainsprings of Indian culture and tradition. Instead, they laid great emphasis to build their foundations of change on old Indian traditions. Contemporary Indian thought shows a deep appreciation of the problems of human life and the destiny of man, and in this sense all modern thinkers were humanists. In this context, Sri Rabindranath Tagore can be cited as the best example because he based all his philosophical ideas, especially social and political, on his humanistic ideals or humanism. Now, let us discuss humanism of Sri Rabindranath Tagore. The popular concept of humanism is that it is an outlook which elevates man above everything else and demonstrates his supremacy over the rest of the creations. It may be defined as an attempt to explore the ways and means to bring about common welfare and progress of mankind through an all-around enrichment of individual lives. It means a system of thought concerned with human affairs in general. Tagore has been one of the most important humanists that India has ever seen, in the sense that he valued man above everything else. He gave man the central place in his religion, his poetical works, his educational and economic thought, and in his socio-political thought. Faith in the supremacy of man and the concern for the fullness of his individuality constituted the essence of Tagore's humanism. He goes to the extent of even converting God into human personality and interpreted him in human terms. Thus, we see that he was not satisfied with mere recognition of man's paramount status in the scheme of things, but he defined reality, truth, and even God in terms of humanity. Tagore's socio-political philosophy cannot be separated from his humanism, and it was an outcome of his humanism. He believed that when every individual of the world unfolds all his potentialities and blooms in his fullest and complete form, and when all human beings coexist in love and companionship with each other, one can experience heaven on earth. So, his social philosophy aims at progress of life in all its aspects. The real progress, according to him, is not only the progress of the individual, but it is the progress of the nations and ultimately of the humanity. Tagore wanted a synthesis of spiritual and material values for real progress of mankind. According to Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, to him, progress and reform consists in conserving the ancient ideas and building upon them. Preserving the soul of the Indian style, we may adopt whatever is good and noble in the West. This is very explicit in his ideas concerning Indian society and its problems and the remedies he suggested for it, and we will discuss it in sequence. Freedom and society. The most important concept of social thought is the relation between individual and society. Tagore believed that society is the expression of the divine force. He believed in the functional and organic concept of society also. In his own words, society as such has no ulterior purpose. It is an end in itself. It is a spontaneous self-expression of man as a social being. It is a natural regulation of human relationships, so that man can develop ideals of life in cooperation with one another. His emphasis on cooperation among individuals and people were derived from his respect for different viewpoints and his feeling that all men are the children of God. He was of opinion that the clashes and conflicts arise only when we place undue emphasis on our sectional interests. When we rise to the consciousness of the unity of the universe, all sectional claims will find their proper place. With such a view of human personality, it is not surprising that Tagore was against regimentation or standardization of every type. Freedom, according to Tagore, has a comprehensive meaning. It is not only social, but also economic, political, and finally spiritual freedom. It was this opinion that made Tagore against social evils, poverty, and political exploitation. Explaining the real meaning of the term freedom in his social thought, Tagore points out that real freedom is of the mind and spirit. It can never come to us from outside. He only has freedom who ideally loves freedom himself and is glad to extend it to others. He who builds walls to create exclusion for others builds walls across his own freedom. He who distrusts freedom in others loses his moral rights to it. Sooner or later, he is lured into the meshes of physical and moral servility. This emphasis of human freedom is the basis of Tagore's religion of man, humanism, cosmopolitanism, and his faith in democracy. Tagore's belief in the freedom and dignity of man was derived from his religious faith and reinforced by his acceptance of the humanism. Again, it was his faith in freedom and equality of the individual that made him a democrat in his social, economic and political outlook. He accepted the Western idea of democracy and added to it the Indian conception of the individual's responsibility for social service. So, we see that in the social sphere, he was a rigid opponent of caste. He believed and repeatedly declared that caste system and its attendant practice of untouchability were among the darkest blots on Indian society. According to him, it had prevented the development of the Indian community into a unified and homogeneous whole. According to Tagore, caste system is an impediment which kills the freedom of mind spirit. He said, the caste idea is not creative, it is merely institutional. It edges human beings according to some mechanical arrangements. It emphasizes the negative side of the individual's separateness. He not only condemned untouchability, but also made solid efforts for its removal. Tagore, as a writer and poet, analyzed the malady in all its details. In his novel Gora, Tagore has given a vivid description of the social evils found in rural India. The different characters in the novel have condemned the practice of untouchability in the strongest words. Hence, we can say that he wanted to establish a society in which there will be no discrimination on the basis of caste, untouchability and religion. Tagore stood for a society in which individuals would find the fullest opportunity of self-expression through creative and cooperative activities. He was a great believer in cooperation in every sphere of life and held that the solution to the problem of poverty in India lay in the adoption of the cooperative method in production and distribution in the field of agriculture. Hence, he can be considered as one of the earliest advocates of cooperative farming. He believed that the principle of cooperation should generate into every sphere of the community life. He was firm in his belief that it is through cooperation that mankind has survived and held that it will create condition of social well-being and cultural progress. In Tagore's view, society is a natural regulatory agency of human relationships so that men can develop ideals of life in cooperation with one another. According to Tagore, society is a collective creation of man through which his or her social being tries to realize itself in its truth and beauty. It is intended for the perfection of man and full realization of the divine in humanity. The function of society is to express the moral and spiritual aspirations of man which belong to his higher nature. Therefore, society should always strive towards the spiritual ideal of man and enable him to realize his wholeness and freedom. To Tagore, freedom is not a license. It is found and realized in the harmony of human relationship. Perfect harmony of relationship provides perfect freedom. the arrangement of interdependence is the origin of freedom. He held that the history of the growth of freedom is the history of the perfection of human relationship. According to him, freedom is a precondition for life and progress. It is not something found outside society, but it is possible only within society. Freedom in its true sense for him is the liberation of the mind of man and realization of spiritual unity. It should enable man to realize his unity with the universal and realize his dharma, the truth of eternal man. Tagore was aware that the impediments in the faith of freedom are the power of money and organized propaganda. He said that they create the atmosphere of distrust, timidity and antipathy. Real freedom, according to him, should remove the barriers erected by the power of money, organized propaganda and the caste system. This will ensure the true operation of democracy and democratic institutions. Thus, freedom in Tagore's philosophy determines the task of individual in serving and enriching the countrymen, because he was of the opinion that service and work are the natural rights of man. All men must work for their living, and each individual must be valued for his distinctive contribution to social life. But if for any reason he is unable to maintain himself, the community must provide him with the necessities of life. In return, the individual must contribute to the society to the limit of his capacity. Here we find a reciprocal relation between the life of individual and society. That is, the spontaneous self-expression of the individual would enrich the life, the community, and the expression of communal life would add to the fulfillment of the individual. Tagore's concern for the individual made him suspicious of large organizations in the economic as well as the political sphere. In politics, he believed in a federal union of smaller autonomous units, for he thought that they offered the individual the greatest opportunity of freedom and self-expression. In social and economic matters, he preferred smaller cooperative unions, as he realized that the individual was likely to be submerged in the giant organizations that had grown up in the Western world. He held that it is only through cooperation we can convert our individual weaknesses into political strength. He believed that such cooperation in the political sphere can be best developed through local self-government, because the individual finds fulfillment only when he is autonomous and the community flourishes only when it is responsible for its own welfare. For him, freedom in the sense of independence has no content and therefore no meaning. Perfect freedom lies in the perfect harmony of relationship, which we realize in this world not through our response to it in knowing, but in living. In other words, we can say that Tagore held that freedom attained through one's creative pursuits alone is not high enough. Higher than that is a freedom attained in the social field in cooperation with our fellow beings. State, nationalism and freedom. As Tagore was a believer in individual freedom, he was against the dominance of the state. He wanted the state to function as a subordinate institution for the maintenance of law and order. But he was not an anarchist, because he did not think that the state's functions are only negative. Like his contemporary Indian thinkers, he believed in a welfare state. Tagore considered society as prior to state, as for him the state's principal function was the maintenance of law and order and society. According to him, state was a living organism for mediating a harmony between antagonism and division. The difference between the West and India is that the former placed emphasis on state and the latter on the society. Hence, the society is the source of welfare in India. Tagore held that one of the greatest achievements of ancient Indian culture had been to demarcate clearly the powers and functions of state and society. In his opinion, Indian society had survived through many ups and downs of history because it had defined the welfare of society as largely a non-political function and placed it in the hands of the community rather than the state. Tagore discouraged the idea of looking to the state for the solution of all the problems of the people. Instead, he differentiated the society from the state and stood for the solution of local problems by the local samitis of the people. Hence, we can say that the ideal of individual freedom of Tagore did not lead to isolation and atomized individualism, but to cooperation and organization. He held that the mainspring of all social progress lay in human cooperation and mutual aid. So, he wanted to organize samitis in every village with the idea of that they would solve the problems of agriculture, transport, education, etc. He considered the Leviathan state as a great danger to the freedom of man, and he tried to develop in India a social order which would not absolutely depend upon a state. Therefore, the most important aspect of his political philosophy was not the struggle for the state power, but to educate and organize the people to make them fit for freedom and democracy. As a passionate advocate of individual freedom, Sri Rabindranath was against all sorts of state authoritarianism. As stated earlier, he was not an anarchist, but he tried to limit the powers of the state to the minimum possible extent. But he always reminded that individualism should not lead to laissez-faire, individualism and cutthroat competition. He believed that man is by nature individual as well as social, and the real problem is to create a harmony between these two sides of man. Thus, we see that while Tagore placed the greatest emphasis on the freedom and dignity of the individual, he was equally conscious of his obligations to society. Tagore extended the principle of the right and dignity of individual to the case of nations as well. He recognized the right of each nation to work out its own destiny, but at the same time, he proclaimed that national claims must never encroach upon human obligations. An awareness of the dangers of nationalism made Rabindranath a votary of individual freedom. Nationalism as an ideology which considers the interest of the nation as a supreme value and ignores all considerations of humanity and morality was boldly rejected by the poet. He was of opinion that in international relations, nationalism leads to national rivalry and jealousy, and it also goes against the spirit of genuine cooperation which alone can lead to progress. Tagore attempted to assess the ill effects of nationalism when it turned into a cult and a religion. His humanism and universalism did not permit him to divide the people on the basis of artificial categories of nations and nationalities. The idea of unity based on the consideration of geographical boundaries did not appeal him. He thought that such nationalism is nothing but organized selfishness. Tagore considered such a concept inhuman and unspiritual. He held that nationalism implied the evolution of perfect organization of power, but not spiritual idealism. He said, nationalism is a battering of higher aspirations of life for profit and power, which cuts at the very roots of goodness, justice and truth in human relationships. He saw in the growth of nationalism a cruel epidemic of evil that is sweeping over the human world of the present age and eating into its moral vitality. Hence, he considered it as the most dangerous thing that undermines the supremacy of man. Sri Rabindranath Tagore believed that the concept of nationalism was dangerous to the West as well as India. The West had experienced how individualism divided morality into convenient compartments instead of making it a pervasive force of life. But according to him, the case of India was different from that of the West. He proclaimed that the unity of India was being and shall always be a unity in diversity, in which every language, every religion and every culture will have its due place. He thought that these differences should not be suppressed, but should be given their proper place in a large whole. He pleaded for cooperation and not for competition among different ideals. He wanted that there should be unity through differences. He firmly believed that it is not possible to achieve it through nationalism. So, he stood for patriotism instead of nationalism. Tagore was a great patriot, and at the same time he was an internationalist and a humanist. His political thought may be perceived as cosmopolitan universal humanism. According to Tagore, the highest aim of all political activity should be to create national unity. He desired that our political program should be dominated by the constructive ideas of spiritual freedom. Tagore's political thought was the climax of social thought. In a social thought, the higher includes and integrates the lower and also transcends it. Thus, he was a patriot, and his patriotism was subordinated to internationalism. Tagore, however, was conscious of the fact that in the progress of collective consciousness of man, nationalism was a necessary step from individualism to humanism. Hence, we admitted nationalism, but wanted to limit it so that it may not come into conflict with other nations. Hence, he maintained, ideally speaking, the nationalism which stands for the expression of the collective self-interest of people need not be ashamed of itself if it maintains its true limitations. Without these self-limitations, nationalism becomes a profession. It becomes a profession of training people for narrow ideas, and then it becomes a destructive idea. Therefore, Tagore held that increase in nationalist sentiments is a danger to human civilization itself. He was led to this judgment also because of the examples of extreme nationalism presented by Germany, Italy, England and other nations in Europe, who tried to expand their empire everywhere to achieve their own selfish interests. Thus, Tagore rightly asserted, with the unchecked growth of nationalism, the moral foundation of man's civilization is unconscious by undergoing a change. The ideal of the social man is unselfishness, but the ideal of the nation, like that of the professional man, is selfishness. That is why selfishness in the individual is condemned, while in the nation it is extolled, which leads to hopeless moral blindness, confusing the religion of the people with the religion of the nation. We find that nation and nationalism with certain limitations can do no good to people. Those limitations may be taken as theoretically possible, but practically once when these cults are given ground, they go unchecked. Therefore, in place of nationalism, Tagore pleaded for internationalism. He was convinced that cooperation and friendship between nations is absolutely necessary for the progress of mankind. It has been generally accepted that no nation can solve its problems unless the problems of humanity have been solved. In the progress of humanity, according to Tagore, each nation will use its special gifts for the good of mankind, and spirituality will be the contribution of India. Pointing out to internationalism as a need of our time, Tagore maintained that for its own safety, each nation should now work for universal welfare. It was to meet this end that Tagore established Vishwa Bharati. The international aim of this reputed institution was explicit from the threefold program, including consolidation of Indian culture, consolidation of Asian culture, and finally, cultivation of international contact in the fields of learning and culture. Tagore believed that each race should be allowed to develop itself. At the same time, a sense of unity should be developed in people, so that keeping their identities, the different races and nations can meet and unite with each other for the national and universal peace. The Indian national anthem, which is one of Tagore's greatest gifts to India, reflects this ideal of a world where there will be friendship and cooperation among all men and mutual regard and respect among all people. Here the poet seeks welfare not for India, our country alone, but for the entire world. This clearly indicates the cosmopolitan universal humanism of Tagore, as he maintains that for its own safety, each nation should work for universal welfare. Now, let us summarize the whole session. In this module, we analyzed the socio-political views of Rabindranath Tagore. These philosophical thoughts are scattered in his literature, and one has to derive and systematize the philosophy out of them. His humanism is expressed through his writings. He gave man a central place and recognized him as the crown of creation. He extended this humanistic approach to socio-political problems also. He visualized a society based on perfect harmony and cooperation, which is free from exploitation. The society was intended for the perfection of man and for the full realization of the divine in humanity. He held that freedom in its true sense is a liberation of the mind of man and the realization of spiritual unity, and he pleaded for internationalism. Thus, he tried to base a socio-political philosophy on the foundation of social and moral traditions of our country. Now, here are a few assignments for you to work out. First one, discuss the importance of humanism and the philosophy of Rabindranath Tagore. Second, analyze the concept of freedom in Tagore's social thought. Third, why did Tagore condemn the practice of untouchability? Fourth, what are the arguments of Tagore against nationalism? Fifth, explain why Tagore considered society as prior to state. Now, here are a few books for your reference. First one, Nationalism, written by Rabindranath Tagore, published by Macmillan, London 1950. Next, Creative Unity, written by Rabindranath Tagore, published by Macmillan, London 1925. Next one, Religion of Man, written by Rabindranath Tagore, published by Macmillan, London 1953. Next is Political Thinkers of Modern India, volume 25, Rabindranath Tagore, edited by Virendra Grover, published by Deep and Deep Publications, New Delhi 1993. Next is Politics and Society, Ram Mohan Roy to Nehru, written by Dr. G. N. Sharma and Dr. Moin Shakir, published by Parmial Prakashan, Aurangabad 1976. Next is Indian Social Thought, written by Ramnath Sharma and Rajendra K. Sharma, published by Media Promoters and Publishers, Bombay 1984. Next is Contemporary Indian Philosophy, written by T. M. P. Mahadevan and G. Saroja, published by Sterling Publishers, New Delhi 1985. Thank you for watching the session. See you in the next session. Until then, bye.